if I'm messing up the Kathmandu, but मैले यो विषयमा एउटा पेपर लेखेको छु जुन पेपर अब आर्टिकलको रूपमा जर्नल एभिएसन स्टडिजमा अगस्त महिनामा छापिन्छ अनि त्यसैको आधारमा आज बोल्छु मैले चाहिँ इङ्ग्लिसमा बोल्नु पर्ला किनभने इङ्ग्लिसमा लेखिएको छ तर छलफलको लागि हामी नेपालीमा पनि गर्न सक्छौँ जब त्यो छोटो हुँदैन होला यो 40-45 मिनट लाग्न सक्छ तर तपाईँहरूलाई बोर्ड नलागोस् भनेर मैले पनि केही फोटो बनाइरहेको छु अनि सुन्दै गर्नु होला अनि आइदिनु भएकोमा धेरै धन्यवाद. So I'll begin with there's a verse from a Mahakavya by Siddhicharan Shrestha, Bhimsen Thapa Mahakavya. Taro nak samastakan tipurko he uchata kritrim Jami lak tio pavitra pasina he megha ko ashram Seto stamba sukirtiko Dharahara Deo malaibida he aglo prahari sorry nagar ko Deo malai bida. Mero anuvad. So, O man-made height, the nose held high of all of Kantipur, O refuge of the clouds, we who built you were 100,000 laborers, our sacred sweat. O Dharahara, white pillar of glory, bid me farewell. O towering guard of the city, bid me farewell. Anthony Oliver Smith, who is one of the leading anthropologists of disaster studies, has written that, and I quote, the fundamental features of society and culture are laid bare in stark relief by disasters. And disasters often reveal the deeper social grammar of a people. But in his influential study of the aftermath of the 2001 Gujarat earthquake, my colleague Edward Simpson disagrees. He describes the post-disaster period of abnormality and confusion as, and I quote, a short-lived and exceptional moment, marked by the failure of everyday grammar, rather than its refinement or condensation. It is instead the aftermath that may reveal what is dear. So I've taken revealing what is dear from this line from Edward Simpson. When the population affected by a disaster is ethnically, linguistically, or culturally diverse, and when patterns of inequality that derive from this diversity are historically entrenched, political and cultural contestation become inextricably intertwined. A population that has suffered the impact of a disaster is inevitably more aware of what Simpson calls the cultural battles of the aftermath than those who come from outside to intervene. So the traditions, artifacts, buildings and practices that turn out to be most dear to the affected population may not be exactly what others expect them to be. And in the case that I'm talking about in this paper, the symbol that was adopted as a focal point for the most visible public expressions of both grief and hope was one, the Dharahara, that was seen both domestically and internationally as an architectural anachronism of little value and little importance. So the discussion is going to revolve around this, the ruined stump of the Dharahara, which you are all familiar with, and I don't need to tell you to describe it to you. But you will also know that the Dharahara was generally unloved by the generations of cultural historians who have written about the riches of the Kathmandu Valley, mainly because of its non-native or imported architectural design. So, for instance, the Dharahara gets no more than one very brief and rather reluctant mention in Mary Shepherd Schlusser's Nepal Mandala, which is generally regarded as the most authoritative study of the cultural history of the Kathmandu Valley. But the destruction of this building had, I would say, a greater and more immediate emotional impact upon a large section of the Nepali public than the loss of the temples and shrines of Nepal's World Heritage Sites, whose destruction was so grievously mourned by the wider world. So why did the public of a country that had until quite recently been the world's last Hindu kingdom adopt as the symbol of its grief and hope a plain, secular building built in a post-colonial Islamic style that had recently been made into a corporatized tourist attraction? Why did the Dharahara come to symbolize for so many Nepalis not only their country's losses, but also its determination to rebuild, thus providing their political leaders with a well of public sentiment on which they could draw to pursue their own post-disaster political agenda? Well, I will address those questions towards the end of my presentation, but I first want to just go over a little bit of the history of the Dharahara and its possible meanings. Now, as you know, in 1815, after sporadic fighting in the foothills of Nepal, the troops of the British East India Company achieved victory over the army of Gorkha. And this military defeat marked the end of some 70 years of rapid Gorkhali expansion. From 1806 until his fall from power in 1837, the Mukhtiar Bhimsen Thapa was the most powerful man in Nepal. Sorry, I missed the slide there. This is Percy Brown's rather uncomplimentary reference to the Dharahara as seen from, I think, the roof of the Kathmandu guest house in 1987, before all the apartment blocks went up. And there's the man in question. So the historical sources differ on whether the Dharahara that Bhimsen Thapa built in the grounds of his mansion, the Bagh Darbar, was the first or the second of two very similar structures. In 1832, the British resident Brian Hodgson recorded the existence of two minarets in this locality. According to Hodgson, the smaller of the two was named after Bhimsen Thapa, and the taller one was built by or for the junior Shah Queen Maharani Lalita Tripura Sundari, just to the north. The two towers are said to have been built in 1824 and 1832, but it's not absolutely certain which one was built on which date. We do know that there was a major earthquake in 1833, and that one of the two Dharaharas collapsed completely in that earthquake and was not rebuilt. Probably it was the larger of the two towers, the one that was named for the Queen, that was rebuilt after that earthquake. It's widely believed that these towers were modelled on monuments in India, such as the minarets that stand at each of the four corners of the Taj Mahal complex in Agra, or possibly the Qutub Minar in Delhi. However, we really don't have any way of knowing what the creators of these monuments intended in terms of their meaning and purpose. This is a picture from sketched during the visit of Prince Valdemar of Prussia, who came via Calcutta to Kathmandu in 1844. And he records in his notes that the ruins of a second tower were still lying around in the gardens of the Bagh Darbar on that date. So anyway, Sidewalkers Private Limited, the company which has managed the Dharahara since about 2004, erected a number of information signboards around the base of the tower. And on these signboards it was stated that the Dharahara's main purpose was to enable the state and the city authorities to summon people to gather on the Tundikale to hear government announcements. The signboards also said that the Dharahara showed religious harmony between Hindu, Muslim and Christian faiths. Now the historical function of the tower as a public gathering point is well attested in the historical sources. But this doesn't really shed much light on the originally intended symbolism of the structure. And this conception of the Dharahara as a symbol of religious unity is not something I've come across in any other source. Of course, the level of convergence between the original intended meaning and the contemporary public understanding of any monument is going to vary from monument to monument. In their book, Monuments and Memory, Nelson and Olin record that somebody called Alois Riegel, who was the first conservative general of monuments in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, distinguished between what he called the intentional monument, whose significance is determined by its makers, and the unintentional monument, which is the product of later events. Some monuments are created for a political, cultural, or religious reason and invested with a specific meaning at that point of creation, and they carry that meaning unchanged down through the generations. Others may be created for a more functional purpose, but then acquire significance and meaning because of events that take place after their founding. Now, at the time of its creation, I would argue the first Dharahara was surely an intentional monument. If we think about the historical context of its creation and the identity of its patron, it seems reasonable to think of it in terms of being a symbol, an expression of defiance and nationalistic pride, directed mainly at the British East India Company that had defeated Bhim Thappa's forces and installed a British resident in Kathmandu. Although it may be thought of as a site of public history by some, it's probably more accurately described in terms of its original intention as a symbol of state-sponsored triumphalism. So once it had been reconstructed in 1833, the remaining of the two Dhararas remained intact until the next major earthquake struck Nepal in 1934, bringing it down again. A photograph in the English translation of Brahmasham Sher's account of the 1934 earthquake shows the Dharahara surrounded by scaffolding as it's being repaired. The new structure, completed in 1936, was a little shorter than the original, with only 9 stories rather than the 11, and a gallery was added to its upper portion. So there, the Dharahara stood for another 2 generations, half torn away from history as a residual artifact of a half-forgotten Gorkhali national pride, while the urban fabric of Kathmandu changed rapidly all around it. In 2004 or 5, the management of the site was passed to Sidewalkers Private Limited, a company which appears to have been established solely for the purpose of managing the Dharahara. Its management allowed members of the public to climb the internal staircase to take in the panoramic view from the top for a fee of 55 Nepali rupees, and a small public garden, a cafe and a ticket office were established at the foot of the tower. It became a popular attraction for Nepali sightseers, and the experience of climbing the Dharahara to admire the view of Kathmandu became like a heritage commodity, rather like a visit to the Eiffel Tower in Paris. The Dharahara collapsed for the second or possibly the third time on 25th of April 2015, killing and injuring a large number of people, many of whom were inside the tower when the earthquake struck. The news of its destruction had a powerful emotional impact on many Nepalis, including people living outside the capital, many of whom only knew it from photographs. The journalist Sarala Gautam, who was travelling in Jajarkot at the time, reported that it was when local people heard that the Dharahara had fallen that they understood the scale of the disaster. They then realised that the disaster was not small, she said. It became clear to her that for many people, many Nepalis in the Western Hills, regardless almost of their gender, ethnicity or caste, the Dharahara was still the preeminent symbol of their capital city and therefore to some extent also of their nation. She recalled many conversations with people whose first comment when they heard she came from Kathmandu was, Dharahara dhalyore. Oh, we hear that the Dharahara has fallen down. And the hundreds of first-person accounts of the 2015 earthquake that appeared in Nepali language newspapers, magazines and social media in the immediate aftermath typically contain an early and very specific reference to the moment when their author has received the news that the Dharahara has fallen. For these people too, this was the moment when the sheer scale and gravity of the disaster first impressed itself upon them. And it would seem that all quarters of the Nepali news media understood this quickly and gave more coverage to the collapse of the Dharahara than to the destruction of any other building. Thus, the Dharahara quickly became the icon of Nepali resilience and determination to rebuild. When I visited Kathmandu for the first time after the earthquake in the July of that year, I saw many young people wearing t-shirts bearing the image of the Dharahara and various versions in both English and Nepali of the slogan, "We will rise again." The iconic image of the tower also became a popular design for tattoos on arms and legs in tattoo parlors across the city, possibly because the earthquake happened at the same time as an international tattoo convention was taking place in the Iconisation Hotel. Some young Nepalis had clearly been affected by its destruction so much that they were willing to have its image inscribed permanently on their bodies. And this tattoo culture is something that my colleague in the SOAS project that we're involved in, as Pratush mentioned, has been documenting. And hopefully she'll publish something on this soon. The Dharahara also featured extensively in Nepali language poetry in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake. The literature section of Thapathali, the online newspaper that came out within 24 hours of the disaster, included 5 poems about the earthquake, of which 3 were inspired by the destruction of the Dharahara. Acharya Prabha's poem, for instance, addressed the Dharahara. Often these poems speak to the Dharahara using the Timi pronoun. The poem described the tower as the grandeur and pride of the country and suggested that everyone should apply a tika from its ruins to their foreheads and then wash them off to create a big pile of unity. Anger quickly followed fear in the public response to the earthquake, and this was mainly directed at the national government, what was seen as a lack of preparedness and an inadequate response. In the immediate aftermath too, many reports were published, especially online, of the looting of archaeological remnants, in which it was alleged that government servants colluded. Many newspaper op-eds blamed Nepali society itself for inviting the calamity, asserting that the earthquake was a consequence of human venality, conceit and ambition. This is often seen as manifesting itself in the building boom in the Kathmandu Valley, since the 1990s, and particularly the construction of tall buildings. But it was also seen in what the authors saw as the weakness of Nepal's political leadership. So just to give you a flavour of this, to quote from Devendra Prasad Sitola's piece in the Annapurna Post, translated into English, he wrote, "The Dharahara fell in the 1934 earthquake too and was reconstructed. But less than 82 years had passed before it fell again. If it is to be re-erected, now we must consider how strong and firm it should be. This has symbolic meanings too. We should not build a Dharahara that is weak like the nation's leaders. For the sake of the nation's history, the Dharahara must symbolically foster strong leadership." So it's as if the Dharahara is providing a focal point for public frustration with the Nepal government's response to the earthquake. A monument that for many represented ordinary citizens' patriotic pride had not been properly maintained, let alone strengthened to withstand earthquakes by the politicians who sought their votes. Not only that, the same politicians had sold it to a private company for commercial exploitation, which many saw and wrote about as a desecration. It's not certain how many people were killed by the collapse of the Dharahara. In fact, the Nepali language news reports did not dwell on these fatalities or enumerate them very consistently. If the Dharahara was going to serve as an icon, it needed not only to kindle anger, but also to offer hope. So the Nepali news media carried numerous articles and stories about the survivors of its fall, and these often provided the backdrop for tales of survival, resilience, and hope for the future. They even got as far as the great British newspaper, the Daily Mail, in which one such story appeared. Since its destruction, the form of the Dharahara has been recreated in both real and virtual spaces. As you all know, within a few months, a miniature Dharahara was built at the traffic intersection immediately opposite the site of the original. A year later, a 21-metre replica was built in the grounds of a secondary school in Navaparsi district. There's a 20-foot replica beside the Prithvi Highway near Malekru. In cyberspace too, the Dharahara lives on. It has its own Twitter identity, where images of replicas have been posted. And YouTube also carries numerous Dharahara-related videos. These include one presentation which claims that the two original Dharaharas actually survived until 1934 and presents them as Nepal's twin towers, thus attempting to draw a parallel with the destruction of the World Trade Center in New York in 2001, and to identify the Dharahara as Kathmandu's own ground zero. Now, the discourse generated by the destruction of this building obviously needs to be understood against the backdrop of ongoing socio-cultural and political contestation in Nepal. So the next few pages of my piece set out the kind of political and historical background to this. But for this audience, I think that's probably redundant because you've lived through it. And I would just say, shall I skip that bit and just bring it further towards the present, towards the time of the earthquake. So in 2014, February 2014, a new government based on a coalition of the Nepali Congress and the UML was formed with Sushil Koirala of the Congress Party as Prime Minister. And this is the government that was in power when the earthquake struck. Excuse me. It was not well prepared to deal with a disaster on such a scale, and the most immediate response, as you all know, came from the Nepali citizenry, particularly the young, the Nepal Army, and Indian and other neighbouring governments. International agencies and donor countries quickly pledged 4.4 billion of emergency aid, 4.4 American dollars of emergency aid, to enable rescue and relief in the short term and reconstruction in the longer term. And the leaders of the main political parties in Nepal decided that the completion of the constitution should now be prioritised and fast-tracked, to which end a 16-point agreement was concluded on the 8th of June. The fast-track constitution that was promulgated in September 2015 was greeted with celebration in most of the hills of Nepal, but with public protests in many areas in the plains. Madhesi political organisations resorted to doing one of the few things they can do to put pressure on the government of Nepal. They blockaded the main arterial road via which Kathmandu receives the bulk of its key supplies. Now led by Khadga Prasad Sharma Oli, who had replaced Sushil Kerala as Prime Minister in October 2015, the government resorted to nationalistic rhetoric in response, asserting that the Indian government was blockading Nepal in support of Madhesi demands. This led to a serious deterioration in relations, not only between the governments of India and Nepal, but also between the populations of Nepal's hills and plains. The political potency of the Dharahara as a symbol of nationalism, and arguably of Gorkhali Hill nationalism at that, was not lost on the government of the day. In April 2016, the Prime Minister attended a function at the site of the Dharahara to mark the first anniversary of the quake. A minute's silence was observed, and the candle display laid out in the Basantapur Square featured the outlines of the Kastamandapa and the Dharahara, the two buildings that had by this time acquired the status of iconic representations of the disaster of 12 months before. A Dharahara reconstruction campaign had been launched by the Prime Minister in February 2016. He declared, "The Dharahara is a symbol of our unity and strength. It is an identity of all Nepalis. It needs to be reconstructed through funds collected from each individual." He declared to the Legislative Assembly later in the year that the Dharahara was a pariche, a characteristic feature of the nation. He said it would be wrong to restore the Dharahara using funds from international aid or from the National Treasury, and that it should be reconstructed from the level of the people, so that people would think of it as my Dharahara. Shortly after the first anniversary of the quake, an announcement was posted on the homepage of the National Reconstruction Authority website headed Mero Dharahara Maafi Bananshu Abhiyan. This gave details of the bank account to which donation should be submitted and exhorted the Nepali people to contribute to the restoration of the Dharahara, which it described as a symbol of the selfhood and pride of the Nepali people. However, 1 month after the Prime Minister had called on the public to donate, Republica newspaper reported that not a single rupee had been received, except for the money donated by the Prime Minister and other ministers as 1 month of their salaries. And the Republica reporter attributed this to a lack of trust in the government. It may also have been related to a controversy over Sidewalker's ownership and management of the site. On one posting on Facebook said, "Why should the people apply their money to build Dharahara to feed businessmen? Give us an answer, Prime Minister." However, Nepal's political leadership forged ahead with the idea of rebuilding the Dharahara through public subscription, and in August 2016, plans were unveiled for a new tower. According to newspaper reports, this would stand beside the remains of the old tower, which would be maintained as an earthquake memorial. In September of last year, 2018, the contract for the building of a new Dharahara was awarded to a Nepali construction company and its Chinese joint venture partner, and the foundation stone was laid by the Prime Minister on the 26th of December. So, I would say the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of the 2015 earthquake saw a resurgence of national feeling in Nepal after a 10-year period during which national identity had been a contested concept. Calls for unity and a common effort to enable Nepal to rise again issued from every political quarter. So a fragile government that was reluctant to keep its predecessors' promises to its minorities sought to exploit popular majoritarian understandings of history, heritage, and nationhood. Its prime minister recognized the particular potency of the Dharahara for the hill communities that formed his party's main constituency and sought to amplify the public mourning for a building that was seen by many as a celebration of their embattled national pride. The post-earthquake nationalism that quickly prevailed was a major diversion from the discourse of inclusiveness and minority ethnic assertion that had formed an important part of Nepali political debate for the previous 7 years. The iconisation and reconstruction of the Dharahara was opposed by some, nonetheless. The renowned senior cultural scholar Satyamohan Joshi wrote that despite all the grief that had been expressed about its loss, it was much less important than the scores of Newar-style temples that had also been destroyed. The temples, he said, had their own originality and identity, while the Dharahara did not. But it may be that the temples and palace squares of the valley's cities were viewed by a wider national public as less their own than the Dharahara, maybe as artifacts specifically of the medieval Newar culture of the valley, or maybe they saw them as ticketed attractions mainly for foreign tourists. A representational dichotomy was very clearly apparent. When the need arose to pictorialize the loss of cultural heritage incurred during the earthquake, the outside world invariably reached for images of collapsed and damaged Newar sites and buildings, but it was the Dharahara that dominated the images presented in the Nepali language media. In their book, Contested Histories in Public Space, Valkowitz and Nauer caution against the notion of a single public. They point out that in many diverse societies, factors of race, class, gender, and citizenship shape individuals' investment in national narratives. They argue that we should conceive of what they, and I quote, multiple publics with divergent and often competing interests and different stakes in how histories are represented. So what were the boundaries and contours of the Nepali public that took the Dharahara to its heart as a symbol of both loss and pride? To borrow Edward Simpson's words again, to which Nepali public was the Dharahara dear? To understand this dichotomy, it would be necessary to explore the structure and composition of the Nepali public more deeply, which is beyond the scope of this discussion. But I'll offer a few preliminary remarks nonetheless. Some explanation for the relationship between the Dharahara and the public that held it dear may be sought in the nature of the monument itself. First of all, it was tall, visible, and fabled, the dominant landmark of the city, capital city of Nepal. The iconic status it held for nearly 200 years was clearly due in part to the simple fact that it was an object whose simple, primary, and very male shape was visible from a wide radius within the capital valley. It was, after all, the tallest structure in the Kathmandu Valley for at least 6 generations of the Nepali public. It may also be significant that the Dharahara was perceived to be a secular building, so emotionally and politically available to all, regardless of their religious faith or affiliation. The Dharahara was also an important landmark for those who arrived in the capital by road from other parts of the country. The Sundhara locality in which it stood has long been a transport hub, and the ticket office of many domestic bus companies are still located there. Thus, for many Nepalis arriving in their capital after journeys that may have been long and arduous, the Dharahara, along with nearby monuments such as the Gangtagar and the Rani Pokhri, were the first things to be seen, and they became more familiar as emblems of the capital than the pagoda scape of palaces and shrines that lies just a few minutes away. As the journalist Sarala Gautam told me, and I quote, "The heritage sites may be important for people who live here in Kathmandu, but for those who have come for the first time, or who have only visited once, or have never even been here, it's the Dharahara." More tentatively, we could also look for answers in divergences in educational history, socioeconomic class, and ethnicity. During the Panchayat period, generations of school children were taught in state schools that Bhimsen Thapa, the creator of the Dharahara, was Nepal's first prime minister and a heroic defender of Nepal's independence and sovereignty, whilst the Ranas were tyrants and obstacles to the nation's development. This clear distinction, propagated through the state school curriculum, found new resonance in the aftermath of the 2015 earthquake. This distinction between the regimes of Bhimsen Thapa and the Ranas who came soon after him may not have been imparted to younger members of the capital's present-day elite, many of whom were educated outside the state system after the early 90s. As a consequence, many of them perhaps lumped the two regimes together, and they have a very disdainful attitude to the Dharahara and to the public outpouring of grief at its loss. The monument's historical and political salience for contemporary Nepal might also be expected to be contested by the Janajati organizations that have been challenging the continued monopolization of power and privilege by the descendants of the historical Gorkhali elite. But many members of minority groups were also a part of the Nepali public and not only held the Dharahara dear, but were also receptive to the rallying cry of Gorkhali Hill nationalism. Just a quick final picture of the rebuilding site. I managed to sneak my way through the gate and take some pictures a few weeks ago, and I was informed by the site manager, safety officer, that this is actually going to have 22 stories, and the budget is 3.45 billion, so it's actually going to be much larger than the original Dharahara. So let me move to my conclusion, and I thank you for listening so politely. The case of the Dharahara shows that endogenous evaluations of heritage can be inflected by questions of politics, social class, and power. The fact that the dearness of a particular monument to a large portion of disaster-affected national public was unsuspected by the World Heritage Authorities, and the fact that it even disappointed other sections of the same national public shows that these authorities' understanding of this particular public was limited, as was perhaps also this public's understanding of itself. So, a major earthquake strikes. Monuments, houses, schools, and infrastructure collapse. Many people die. The first to respond to the emergency are the army, urban youth, neighbouring countries. Political leaders are publicly criticised for their inadequacy of their preparedness and the slowness of their response. People speak, read and write of the unifying and levelling effects of the disaster. Some begin to imagine a future under a new set of leaders with a new political culture. When the leaders do respond, they respond politically. They come together to draft and promulgate a long-awaited constitution. This is seen by some to renege on promises and commitments made 8 years earlier. In particular, it alienates sections of the Madesi population of the south, leading to public protests, violence, and a major international dispute. The leaders managed to unite the non-elite majority of the hill population behind them, a population for whom a tall white tower in Kathmandu, erected in an act of state-sponsored triumphalism 200 years ago, is revealed to be more dear than anyone knew, both as a symbol of their loss and as an icon for the restoration of that loss. The immediate loss is of lives and buildings, but this public also mourns a dimly remembered glorious national pride, especially as the promulgation of a new constitution provokes what they are told is a blockade by their powerful southern neighbour. Thus, as the moment of critical juncture passes and the likelihood of fundamental change fades, old memories and old forgettings are drawn upon in order to reinstate in strengthened forms the power structures and hierarchies of the pre-disaster status quo. Thank you.